Before we begin this story of heartbreak and betrayal, I want to urge you all to subscribe to my YouTube channel because we dive deep into real-life stories, raw emotions, and life-changing decisions. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on powerful narratives that interest and resonate with you. Mark had always been the practical one in his household. As a systems analyst, he thrived on details, patterns, and data. But his wife, Claire, was his complete opposite, a free spirit who brought warmth and spontaneity to his otherwise calculated world. Their differences often balanced each other out, creating a dynamic he had always cherished. But lately, things had felt off. It wasn't anything tangible. Claire still smiled the same way, laughed at his dry jokes, and teased him when he got too lost in his work. Yet, there was a subtle distance between them that he couldn't quite name. At first, he dismissed it as a side effect of their busy lives. Between his demanding job and her commitments as an art teacher, they barely had time for themselves, let alone each other. One evening when Claire was out with the kids, Mark's friend and colleague, Simon, came over to watch a football game. Halfway through the match, Simon casually brought up the new home security system he'd installed. Aside from full protection, "You'd be amazed at what you catch on those things," Simon said, laughing. "My neighbor's dog kept sneaking into my yard. I'd have never known if I didn't have the cameras." Mark had nodded politely, only half listening. But later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Simon's words came back to him. Peace of mind. The phrase echoed in his mind, mingling with the unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The next day, during a coffee break, Mark did some research. This was about ensuring the safety of his home. They lived in a good neighborhood, but times were unpredictable. The kids' safety mattered. Claire's safety mattered. He chose a discreet system with small, high-resolution cameras that could be easily hidden. The system boasted advanced motion detection and a user-friendly app that allowed real-time monitoring from his phone. By the end of the week, the cameras had arrived. Mark decided to install them on a Saturday when Claire was out hosting an art workshop. He positioned them carefully, one near the front door, another in the living room, and one overlooking the kitchen. For the bedroom, he hesitated. It felt invasive, even though the camera would only be facing the window. Ultimately, he installed it, reasoning that it was for security, not surveillance. Mark totally forgot to tell Claire about the cameras, and over the first few days, he barely remembered the cameras were there. His routine was as monotonous as ever. Work, dinner, sleep, repeat. But on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, while on his lunch break, he suddenly remembered about it and decided to check the app out of curiosity. As the live feeds loaded, Mark felt a small surge of satisfaction. The cameras were working perfectly, capturing crisp images of their home. He watched for a few moments, noting the stillness of the living room and the faint movement of the curtains in the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, but as he scrolled through the footage from the previous day, something unusual caught his eye: a figure entering their house around noon. Mark stared at the footage, his brow furrowing as he replayed the clip. The timestamp read 12:03 p.m., a time when he knew Claire was usually at home, preparing for her afternoon classes. The figure was blurry at first, caught just as they entered through the back door, but the next frame was clearer. It was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident stride. He carried nothing in his hands, no toolbox, no clipboard, nothing to suggest he was a service worker or a deliveryman. Mark tilted his head, trying to place the face, but it didn't ring any bells. "Who was this guy?" he muttered under his breath, leaning closer to the screen. Mark skimmed ahead in the footage, his heart rate picking up as the man made his way into the living room. He seemed at ease, as though he'd been there before. There was no hesitation in his movements. He walked straight to the couch and sat down, casually glancing around like he owned the place. Mark paused the video, his mind racing. He tried to think of a plausible explanation. Maybe he was a neighbor, someone Claire had invited over for a quick chat? But why hadn't she mentioned it? They usually told each other about visitors, no matter how minor the encounter. Feeling the weight of curiosity and unease, Mark let the footage play. A few minutes later, Claire appeared on the screen. She was wearing her favorite casual dress, the one with tiny sunflowers printed all over it, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun. She smiled as she approached the man, and Mark felt a brief wave of relief. They must be friends, he thought, clinging to the possibility. But his relief was short-lived. Claire didn't sit across from the man, or even beside him on the couch. Instead, she stood close, too close. The man reached out, placing a hand on her waist, and she didn't pull away. Mark felt a jolt in his chest, like an electric shock. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He rewound the clip and watched it again, hoping he'd misunderstood. But the scene played out the same way. The man pulled Claire closer, and she leaned down, their faces mere inches apart. Then, without hesitation, she kissed him. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. His hands gripped the edges of his desk as the weight of what he'd just witnessed sank in. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be real." He played the footage again, his eyes glued to the screen. There was no denying it now. The man was holding his wife, his hands resting comfortably on her hips, and she was responding with the kind of familiarity that spoke of more than a casual acquaintance. The room around Mark seemed to blur as a cold, hollow feeling spread through his chest. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen, even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop watching. He fast-forwarded through the footage, needing to know how far this had gone. The camera in the living room didn't capture everything. It had a limited view. At one point, Claire led the man out of frame, toward the hallway that led to the bedroom. Mark's stomach churned. He checked the feed from the bedroom camera, his fingers trembling as he selected the timestamp. The footage was silent, but it didn't need sound to convey the betrayal unfolding before him. The man entered the room first, followed by Claire. She closed the door behind her, leaving it slightly ajar. Mark could see their silhouettes moving in the dim light. He couldn't bring himself to watch further. His hand hovered over the pause button, but he couldn't press it. For a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring blankly at the screen. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And why? Mark sat motionless in his chair, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. His hands were cold, his palms damp with sweat, and his breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms as if to ground himself, but nothing could steady the storm raging inside him. The image of Claire and the stranger played on an endless loop in his mind, each repetition chipping away at the foundation of trust they'd built over years. Every laugh they'd shared, every intimate moment, every promise, it all felt tainted now, overshadowed by what he'd just witnessed. He didn't cry. He couldn't. Instead, a dull ache settled in his chest, growing heavier with each passing second. Mark's analytical mind, the one that had guided him through countless work crises, finally kicked in. If he was going to confront Claire, he needed more than fragments of footage. He needed the full picture. "Calm down," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky but firm. "Don't jump to conclusions yet." He reopened the app and scrolled through the recordings from the past few days. His heart pounded as he scanned the timestamps, looking for anything unusual. It didn't take long to find another instance. A few days earlier, around the same time of day, the footage showed the same man entering the house through the back door. This time, he carried a bouquet of flowers. Claire greeted him with the same warm smile, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him. Mark felt his stomach twist. Mark leaned back in his chair, his hands covering his face. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was an ongoing affair. For a moment, he considered calling Claire right then and there, demanding an explanation. But he stopped himself. What would he even say? What if she lied, twisted the truth to make him doubt what he'd seen? No, he needed to be sure. Mark decided to keep the cameras running, monitoring the feeds closely over the next few days. If there was more to uncover, he wanted to know. He began to take notes, jotting down timestamps and details of each interaction. The logical part of his brain took over, compartmentalizing his pain so he could focus on gathering facts. At night, when Claire returned home, Mark tried to act normal. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Every time she smiled at him, every time she touched his arm or laughed at something he said, it felt like a cruel mockery of their life together. He forced himself to smile back, though it felt like his face might crack under the strain. 3 days later, Mark got his breakthrough. As he reviewed the footage from earlier that afternoon, he noticed something different. This time, Claire and the man were in the kitchen, their voices faint but audible through the camera's microphone. Mark quickly plugged in his headphones, his heart pounding as he strained to hear their conversation. "I can't keep doing this." Claire's voice came through, quiet but tense. The man responded, his tone low and coaxing. "Why not? It's convenient. No one suspects a thing." Claire sighed, the frustration evident in her voice. "Mark's not stupid. If he finds out, this will destroy everything. We can't take that risk anymore." There was a brief silence before Claire continued, her voice firmer now. "If this is going to continue, it has to be at your place. You can't keep coming here. It's too dangerous." The man tried to protest, his tone turning more insistent. "Claire, you're overreacting. He hasn't noticed a thing." Claire cut him off sharply. "Don't underestimate him. Mark is perceptive. If he even gets a hint of this, I can't deal with that fallout." Mark pulled off the headphones, his hands trembling. The weight of her words crashed down on him like a tidal wave. She wasn't just cheating. She was strategizing how to keep it hidden, calculating every move to avoid detection. Her caution wasn't rooted in guilt or regret, but in fear of being exposed. Mark clenched his jaw, his anger mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. The fact that Claire was still intent on maintaining the affair, albeit more discreetly, only fueled the fire within him. The life they'd built together felt like a facade, a cruel joke that he'd been the last to understand. Mark's resolve hardened. He needed more than just fragmented recordings to confront Claire. If she was planning to move the affair to another location, it was only a matter of time before something slipped. He adjusted the camera settings, ensuring that every angle of the house was monitored even more closely. At night, Mark acted as though nothing had changed. When Claire returned home, he greeted her with his usual warmth, though his stomach churned with every interaction. Few days later, Mark found what he was waiting for. His hands trembled as he watched the live feed on his phone. The scene unfolding in his own bedroom was more than he could bear. Claire and the man were intimate on his matrimonial bed. Their laughter was light-hearted, their conversation disturbingly casual. The man leaned over, stroking Claire's hair. "This is the last time, I promise," he said softly. "Next time, you'll come to my place. It'll be safer." Claire sighed but smiled, her hand resting on his. "You'd better mean it. This is already too risky." Mark's heart pounded as the feed continued. He felt trapped between rage and disbelief, his mind racing as the reality of the situation fully sank in. This wasn't a fleeting mistake or moment of weakness. It was deliberate, planned, and carried out in the very space he had shared with Claire for years. When Mark got home that evening, he was eerily calm on the surface. The usual routine unfolded as if nothing was amiss. Claire greeted him with her usual smile, asking about his day, while he responded in kind, masking his turmoil. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," Mark began, his voice steady but cold. Claire's smile faltered. "What's wrong?" Mark opened the video folder on his laptop and played the footage. The sound of her laughter, mixed with the man's voice, echoed in the bedroom. Claire's face turned pale as the images filled the screen. She froze, her hand flying to her mouth as the realization hit her. "Mark," she started, her voice trembling, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said sharply, his tone laced with pain and anger. "Don't try to explain or deny it. I've seen everything. Every moment, every word." Claire's eyes welled with tears. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" Mark snapped, his voice rising. "For you to bring another man into our house? Into our bed?" Claire tried to speak, but her words stumbled over her sobs. "I was lost, Mark. You've been so distant, I felt. Don't you dare put this on me," Mark yelled, standing abruptly. "I've been working to provide for this family, for you, for our kids, and this is how you repay me?" Claire sat in silence, her head bowed, unable to meet his eyes. Mark paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. "I installed those cameras because I wanted to keep us safe. I never thought I'd be watching my wife betray me like this. How long has this been going on?" Claire hesitated, then whispered, "A few months." Mark shook his head in disbelief, the weight of her confession hitting him like a punch to the gut. "A few months? In our home? While our kids were here? Do you even understand what you've done?" "I didn't mean to hurt you," Claire pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Mark laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean to hurt me? You thought about that every time you let him into this house, into our bed." The room fell silent except for Claire's quiet sobs. Mark felt a surge of emotion, anger, sadness, betrayal, all colliding within him. Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. "This isn't just about us, Claire. This affects our kids, our entire family." He looked at her, his eyes hard. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." Claire looked up, desperation in her eyes. "Please, Mark, we can fix this." Mark shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if this is something that can be fixed." He stood, grabbing his coat. "I need time to think. But don't expect things to go back to normal." As Mark walked out of the house that night, the weight of the confrontation bore down on him. His world had been turned upside down, and the road ahead was uncertain. Mark drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, his thoughts racing. The confrontation had left him drained, yet his anger and hurt simmered just beneath the surface. The betrayal felt like an open wound, one that no amount of time or words could heal. Eventually, Mark pulled over into an empty parking lot and sat in silence. He replayed Claire's sobs, her excuses, and the damning video in his mind. The images refused to leave him, haunting him like a bad dream he couldn't wake from. By the time he returned home, the house was silent. Claire had retreated to the guest room, her door shut tight. Mark stood outside for a moment, his hand hovering near the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to enter. Instead, he made his way to the master bedroom, the scene of her betrayal. The bed felt foreign now, a cruel mockery of the love and trust they had once shared. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as the weight of his decision began to crystallize. The next morning, Mark knew what he needed to do. He couldn't allow himself to stay in a marriage built on deceit. For his own sanity, and for the sake of his children, he decided to consult a lawyer. Later that afternoon, Mark walked into Linda Hartwell's office, the experienced divorce attorney who had seen it all. Linda greeted him with a firm handshake, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the storm raging in Mark's heart. "Tell me what happened," she said, motioning for him to sit. Mark recounted the events. The innocent install of the cameras, the beginning of the investigation, and then, finally, the shocking discovery. The man in his house. The intimate moments in their bed. Claire's response, claiming it was the last time, only to suggest that she would continue seeing the man in his house. Linda listened intently, offering a sympathetic look. When he finished, she leaned forward. "Mark, you need to understand something. What she did wasn't just an affair. She has shown no remorse for what happened. She's actively working to keep it going. That's not someone who made a mistake. That's someone who's chosen a path of deceit." Mark felt the weight of her words. "That's what's killing me. I could have forgiven a mistake, but she hasn't made any attempt to fix it. She was just going to keep on with the affair if I didn't find out. I understand how difficult this must be," she continued. "Infidelity is one of the hardest betrayals to process, especially when it happens in your own home. But the good news is that you're taking the right steps to protect yourself and your children." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "I just want this to be over. I want to move on." Linda nodded. "You're right. She doesn't want to face the truth, and that's why you're here. We can move forward with a divorce. You have grounds, especially with the evidence you've gathered. But we'll need to focus on protecting your interests, your assets, and most importantly, your children." That evening, Mark returned home with a clearer sense of purpose. He found Claire in the kitchen, her face weary and tear-streaked. She looked up as he entered, hope flickering in her eyes. "Mark," she started, her voice shaky. "I've been thinking, maybe we can go to counseling. Try to fix this." Mark didn't even flinch. "No, Claire, I'm done." Her face fell. "What do you mean?" He couldn't hold back the bitterness in his voice. "You were going to keep this going. If I hadn't caught you, you would have just continued. No regrets, no change. You told him yourself you'd go to his house. You made it clear you didn't care about me, about our family." Claire's eyes widened, her lips trembling as she tried to form words, but Mark couldn't bear to listen anymore. She had already made her choice, and now he was making his. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," Mark continued, his voice cold. "It's over, Claire. You're going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions now." She sank into the couch, her hands covering her face as the reality of his words hit her. But Mark had no sympathy left, not when she was so ready to destroy everything without a second thought. Over the following weeks, the divorce process began in earnest. Mark threw himself into work and his children, determined to rebuild his life. He focused on creating a stable environment for the kids, shielding them as much as possible from the tension between him and Claire. Despite the pain, Mark began to find solace in the small victories, regaining control of his life, setting boundaries, and rediscovering his own strength. The betrayal had left scars, but it also taught him the value of self-respect and resilience. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Do you think Mark made the right decision? Or do you have your own experience with betrayal you'd like to share? Let's get the conversation going. Ensure you like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel.